Hi, this is Raphael Mudge, the creator of Cobalt Strike. This presentation is Fighting the Toolset. Here's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to introduce the concept of fighting the toolset and what I mean by that. Fighting the toolset is taking things that are properties of Cobalt Strike, tactics it implements, that are there for the purpose of evasion or stealthy operations, and understanding why those are there, but also understanding and appreciating that those same tactics can and are being targeted, and having the judgment as an operator to weigh the risks of one action, in many cases a default one, with the risks of another action. In some cases, the action that the offense version is there to help you avoid. Sometimes one is better, sometimes another is better. And that's what fighting the toolset is. It's making these risk versus reward trade-offs and choosing which way you're going to execute your tasks to achieve your objectives. In this presentation, we're going to talk about some ways to do things different than what the default is in Cobalt Strike. We're going to talk about session prepping, which is a way of safely launching temporary processes so that your use of temporary processes blends in better. We will talk about strategies to avoid the use of PowerShell when you use Cobalt Strike. We will also talk about how to get sessions without the use of payload stagers. That's operating stageless. Also, Cobalt Strike's beacon payload is compiled as a reflective DLL. It is a memory resident injected DLL, and that is a great evasion technique, but it has tells. And so we're going to talk about that with in-memory detections and evasions. Finally, Cobalt Strike makes use of remote process injection to avoid the need to put something on disk rather often. And that can be a liability in some cases, especially when there's technologies in place to detect or prevent remote process injection. So I'm going to speak a few words about working around that or achieving your objectives other ways. Finally, everything here in this presentation is nothing really new. These are things that have been in previous blog posts and videos, certainly for the past 1 to 2 years. So if you're interested in what we talk about here, I'm going to walk you through some resources to get an idea of other material to follow up on all this. Okay, fighting the toolset. So Cobalt Strike's beacon payload includes a lot of design decisions and a lot of decisions to use certain features or offensive techniques. And sometimes those techniques are an advantage. That's certainly why they were implemented and chosen initially. And other times they're a disadvantage. So let's go through some of these and talk about why they're there. First, Cobalt Strike's beacon uses temporary processes for many of its post-exploitation features. What do I mean by that? Well, when you take a screenshot, that feature is not implemented inside a beacon. Instead, Cobalt Strike spawns a temporary process, or I should say beacon spawns a temporary process, and the screenshot tool is injected into that temporary process. It does its thing and feeds the results back to beacon, and the temporary process goes away. That's how that works. Now you may ask, why? Why do I do this? I do it for a lot of reasons. First, it keeps the payload small. I can focus on keeping the core beacon payload simple and small, which yields a more reliable and predictable product. There's also a protect the agent kind of excuse, if you will. So some of these post-exploitation features, let's say one of them crashes for whatever reason. By having that post-exploitation feature live in another process, we actually protect the agent, the beacon agent. So a crash in a remote process will not affect your current foothold or access. And I think that's a really, really big deal, especially when you're executing long-term remote operations during part of a security test. There's also a usability reason for this. So many post-exploitation features need to run from the same architecture, if you will, the same architecture context as the native architecture of the system. Mimikatz is a great example of this. If I want Mimikatz to pull credential material from LSASS, I need to use a 64-bit Mimikatz on a 64-bit system. I absolutely have to do this. And this mechanism of temporary processes allows that to happen consistently. Because if I'm in a 32-bit beacon, I can spawn a 64-bit process, inject Mimikatz into that, and have it behave the same as if I were in a 64-bit beacon. And so there's that usability benefit. Finally, one last thing is some post-exploitation features can actually target existing processes. They don't need to go into a temporary process. And that is a thought-out design decision for a lot of reasons. Let's say I laterally spread over to a target, and I'm in a system context in desktop session 0, and I want to log keystrokes and gather screenshots. Well, if I was using, say, like the Metasploit framework, I could migrate my access to a process in that other desktop session. But migrating is dangerous. I run the risk of losing my agent, and I also run the risk of possibly being in a context where whatever command control channel I have won't work where it did before. Those are both risks. But this model of post-exploitation happening in remote processes, whether it's a temporary one or an existing one, allows me to do things like deploy a keystroke logger into explorer.exe in another desktop session and feed the results back without moving beacon around. So this model has a lot of benefits and a lot of thought behind it. But of course, as we talk about fighting the toolset, we're going to talk about ways to use this model better. And that will be session prepping, of course. What about PowerShell? Today, you might look at some automation that uses PowerShell and kind of scoff at it and be like, why would you do that? Why would you implement that? And a lot of things in Cobalt Strike, a lot of automation uses PowerShell. It uses PowerShell because at one time PowerShell was a free pass. It is a native tool that has the power of any other stack for executing programs. I mean, it can call Win32 APIs through PowerShell, no problem. And Cobalt Strike uses PowerShell often to use a one-liner to bootstrap beacon payload. And you may be asking, why? Why not do something else? Well, PowerShell is a native tool that allows me to run an agent and get it into memory without putting an artifact on disk using a native tool. That's very attractive. Of course, PowerShell today, ever since version 5, has had a lot of hooks and ability to be instrumented. That's things like AMSI, script block logging, and the fact that defenders just look at any unexpected PowerShell instance and scrutinize it. But these things didn't happen out of the blue. They happened because PowerShell was such an overwhelming advantage to attackers that used it. And the defense side pushed back and took some of the advantage away. So now, when you use PowerShell, it's a trade-off. It might be advantageous, it might not. But there was a time when it was always advantageous. What about stagers? Cobalt Strike uses stagers in all of its workflows to deliver the beacon payload. There is no such thing as automation in the default Cobalt Strike product to deliver the beacon payload without a stager. The stager, just for those not familiar with the term, is a very tiny program in Cobalt Strike, they're written in hand-optimized assembly that reaches back to the payload controller, downloads the beacon payload, and then executes it. And the purpose of stagers is to allow us to embed the beacon payload in a size-constrained attack. A great example is with PowerShell. We use a PowerShell one-liner to bootstrap an agent, right? Well, that one-liner is limited by how many characters are allowed in a Windows command line, including the program and its arguments. I can fit a stager that's a few hundred bytes into something like that. I cannot fit a 200, 250 kilobyte payload like beacon into a one-liner. So that's why we use stagers. And they are everywhere in Cobalt Strike's workflows. Another thing about Cobalt Strike's beacon is that beacon is written in C and compiled as a reflective DLL. Whenever beacon is run, it is always resident in memory in some process as a memory-injected DLL. And this has advantages for an attacker. It allows us to run beacon without having to put something on disk potentially, excluding the thing that got us there, right? Which could have been a one-liner, it could have been an executable. But whatever it is, there's no such thing as a on-disk mechanism that's always required to deliver beacon. Beacon is agnostic to the thing that delivers it and runs it. And that's what being a memory-injected DLL, or excuse me, a self-bootstrapping memory-injected DLL gives us. So great advantage. The disadvantage is that this evasion technique that lets us mix and match what delivers us to target, that lets us reside in an existing process and do all our things, this technique has its own tells. And many offense toolsets have had a lot of success with these particular techniques. So it should be no surprise that there's a body of commercial and research work focused on targeting those tells to make it harder to evade detection as a memory-injected DLL. Finally, Cobalt Strike uses remote process injection in some of its artifacts. They migrate, and some of its post-exploitation features. Even the concept of temporary processes for post-exploitation features is, the concept of temporary processes for post-exploitation features relies on remote process injection, right? I spawn that temporary process and inject the capability into it. And remote process injection is great, but it's only an advantage when process injection is not being targeted. When it is being targeted, it might be more beneficial or safer to do things without process injection. And let me give you an example of that trade-off. Cobalt Strike 3.11 introduced a command, execute assembly, to run a .NET executable on target without touching disk. Here's how it works. I run execute assembly, and Cobalt Strike will push to beacon a reflected DLL that loads the .NET CLR. And it will pass to the .NET CLR your actual executable assembly. It will load that assembly and call its entry point with the arguments you provide. The output from that assembly will go back to the operator. All of this is meant to give you the same experience you would have if you ran it from the command line, as if it was on disk. That's exactly what I was aiming for. Here's the thing, though. Let's say remote process injection is off the table completely. All right? What's your alternative? Well, your alternative is to upload the assembly to the target and run it. So you can achieve the same end with process injection or without it. Okay? So uploading to the assembly to the target, it puts something on disk, it exposes your kit. If your blue team does logging of all processes that are launched in their arguments, it might give visibility into what you are doing. So that's a disadvantage. And if application whitelisting is in play, you might find it's not possible to go that route. Why would we do the remote process injection side? Well, we don't have to touch disk. We don't have to expose our arguments to logging. And it's possible that we might be able to make our temporary process something that will get past application whitelisting, something that will be allowed to run. So there's some benefits to the remote process injection approach too. But that remote process injection piece is the dangerous action. And that is the theme of this presentation. Really, it is. All of these things are a trade-off. Benefit in some cases, not a benefit in others. But in those other cases, there are alternatives. So now that I've kind of hammered on that for a little while, let's actually jump into those alternatives for all of these things. Let's start with session prepping. I mentioned that Cobalt Strike's beacon payload does spawn temporary processes to house some of its post-exploitation features. Session prepping is a way to shape how those temporary processes are launched and which process is your temporary process to blend in. Why do we do this? We do it because not all process trees are created equally, okay? A more credible process tree is likely to get less scrutiny and less trouble than something that is very obviously bad. So what are some things that can buy your process credibility? Well, if you're dropping your own artifact to disk, certainly a valid digital signature from a trusted entity will help. Cobalt Strike 3.7 introduced the ability to sign your executables and DLLs if you have a code signing cert. Like that's built into the tool set. Another thing is focusing on having a plausible and safe parent-child process relationship. What do I mean by that? Well, if Microsoft Word spawns Rundle32, that's pretty weird. I mean, that looks like an attack. And there are certainly a lot of solutions that look for and target things like that. What about command.exe? Sometimes that's used legitimately, other times not. If command.exe is launched from explorer.exe, it's possible that the end user was running a command shell for whatever reason. But if command.exe is launched from, I don't know, iexplore.exe, that's kind of weird, don't you think? So the parent-child process relationship is something to think about. Also, another thing to deal with session prepping is that you really want to use a process, a temporary process, that's something not normally seen in offense activity. So regserve32, probably not the thing to go to. Rundle32, probably not the thing to go to. Rundle32 is a default used throughout Cobalt Strike, throughout its workflows. Occasionally I get an email or even a message on Twitter saying, hey, Raf, I've got an indicator for you. And I'm like, okay. And it'll be brought to my attention that Cobalt Strike's using Rundle32. And I'll say, look, yeah, that's the default. It's the default because something has to be the default. I could use Notepad, like Metasploit, but that's going to be scrutinized. So what do? The best I can do, and the best I should do for you, is leave the default what it is, make you aware that it's the default, and give you advice on how to change it. And that's my approach. So make sure that when you're trying to give credibility to your process tree, that your temporary processes are not something normally associated with offense activity. All right, so how do you session prep, right? Let's talk about that. So again, session prepping, changing how Beacon spawns processes. First step, use the PS command to survey what's running on the target, what context you're in. The PS command in Beacon does not launch anything. It just uses Win32 APIs. And it will give you back the processes that are running, who they're running as, and what the parent process is and the current process PID. Now, one of the things you want to think about is, for your current context, what is a good plausible parent process that might spawn child processes? For example, if I'm in a user context, Explorer.exe is a great candidate because things launched by Explorer are plausibly things the user chose to launch. And in Cobalt Strike versions 3.8 and later, you can change which process the beacon payload anchors its child processes to. So you don't have to make it look like beacon launched anything. If you're living in, like, say, the Java updater, you can run a command shell and make it look like Explorer.exe launched it. And the way you do that is just do ppid, the new parent process, and everything Cobalt Strike launches will be anchored to that alternate parent process. It's a pretty cool technology. What about those temporary processes? Well, you can change what Cobalt Strike uses as a temporary process for its post-exploitation jobs in your malleable C2 profile, so you can change the default. But you can also change it session by session by session. And the way you do that is with the spawn2 command. Use spawn2, x86, and a path to a program, and Beacon will use that for its post-exploitation jobs, the 32-bit ones going forward. Spawn2 x64, the same thing for the 64-bit ones. And you can really have fun with this. For example, let's say I see Internet Explorer running. Well, I could make Internet Explorer, the parent one, my ppid, and I can do things like taking advantage of the fact that Internet Explorer is the parent, and each tab has its own iExplorer process. I can make that my spawn2. I can make Internet Explorer my spawn2. So then when Beacon is spawning processes, it just looks like new tabs opening and closing in Internet Explorer. And this kind of creative blending in is what session prepping is all about. All right, PowerShell. I know in the introduction I kind of mentioned that PowerShell is well instrumented. It's the AMSI, the script block logging, and the scrutiny new launches of PowerShell get. And it's heavily watched by defenders. In these circumstances, when these things are being taken advantage of, it really is best to avoid the use of PowerShell in your operations. How do you do that? Well, one thing, and this is more of a future-looking thing, if your team has a library of capability written in PowerShell, consider porting some of that over to .NET. One of my dreams would be to see PowerUp and PowerView written in C#. If I had those, then I could, of course, drop them to disk and run them if I really needed to, or I could use the execute assembly command to run them. And that would be really, really nice. PowerShell is often used to get a payload on target as well. Sometimes a user-driven attack like an HTML application is combined with a PowerShell one-liner to kick a payload off. Well, Cobalt Strike has the scripted web delivery feature, and there are one-liner options other than PowerShell. And the ones in Cobalt Strike are just a start. Like, there's a universe of things you can explore to find ways to bootstrap a payload. Now, some of them are not as nice as PowerShell. Like, for example, I have one that uses bitsadmin to download an executable and run it. An uninstrumented scripting environment is much better, I think, but it's an option. I mentioned, though, that Beacon uses PowerShell in a lot of its automation. Now, I've always been 1 foot in the world of PowerShell and what it gives me, and 1 foot out. And Cobalt Strike's really been that way since 2014. So here's some places where Beacon uses PowerShell and options to kind of work without it. Certainly for lateral movement, psexec PowerShell is a long favorite of some people. But Beacon does have a psexec command. The psexec command in Beacon uses APIs. It does not run anything on the attacking beacon, the pivot beacon. And what it does is it uploads a executable to the target, to either admin dollar or C dollar or whatever share you specify. It creates a service to run that executable. The executable runs and migrates, and then the psexec command and beacon tears down that service and removes the executable. And that's how that works. So it's an option, something to be aware of. What about WMI? Well, the WMI command and beacon, which is automation for lateral movement, does use PowerShell. It uses PowerShell on the pivot beacon, and it uses PowerShell on the remote target to run your payload, or your payload stager even. You're not really stuck with that approach. For example, if I want to use WMI for lateral movement, I'm a big fan of doing lateral movement by hand. I always have been. My courses since 2014's Tradecraft have emphasized lateral movement by hand very heavily. And one option is to just do shell wimic, whack node, the target, process call create, and whatever I want to run. And that whatever I run can be really anything. It can be something to weaken the remote target. It can be something to run a capability I've copied over. So that's an option. The main thing here is you're not constrained to the automation. If you are running PowerShell today, the PowerShell command and beacon uses PowerShell exe. That, of course, can be dangerous. In some cases, the PowerPick command, which is a temporary post-exploitation job, very similar to execute assembly in a lot of ways, the PowerPick command will let you run PowerShell without PowerShell exe. But be aware, PowerPick tries to downgrade to PowerShell v2. And that is one way, in some cases, to duck past the AMSI and script block logging, because PowerShell v2 doesn't have those things. But in environments where PowerShell v2 has been removed, or newer installations of Windows that just don't include it, well, PowerPick is going to be subject to the same scrutiny that you're often going to see for just PowerShell run from the command line. So that's not a permanent solution. It does buy time, but in some environments that time's run out. Okay, well, what about spawning sessions as another user? Spawn as uses a PowerShell one-liner to run a payload. You'll be surprised by this benefit, to run a payload without putting something on disk. Same thing I said earlier, right? There is an alternative to spawn as, and that is the run as command. The run as command uses the same mechanism spawn as does, but without PowerShell. Run as calls a Windows API that accepts a domain, a user, and a password, and a command and arguments to run. That's it. So if you determine that spawn as is not the thing to do, an alternative is to generate an artifact, say an executable, upload it, and use run as to run it with those alternate creds. Do you see the trade-off here? PowerShell, great. I can spawn an agent with a native tool and not put something on disk. But when PowerShell's off the table or undesirable, well then suddenly maybe putting something on disk, the risks of doing that outweigh the risks of using PowerShell. That's his whole presentation. It's everything here is that concept, is making that trade-off of which way to go. Similar story for SpawnU. That's a command to spawn a session under another process. SpawnU uses PowerShell. RunU lets you pick something arbitrary to run. Whatever it is your choice. Another place where this comes into play is the UAC token duplication bypass introduced in Cobalt Strike 3.11. The workflow for privilege escalation with the elevate command uses PowerShell. The UAC token duplication bypass to go from a medium integrity context to a high integrity context, it lets us run whatever we want in a high integrity context. So the UAC token duplication exploit uses PowerShell to do that. It's like, hey, yeah, give me a session. I'm going to use PowerShell to do it. Why? Again, I don't have to put an artifact on disk. But again, this whole discussion, if PowerShell's off the table or PowerShell's too dangerous, it's not the approach you want to take. So what do? Well, that's why Cobalt Strike 3.11 has the run as admin command, which does the same bypass. It's the same raw mechanism to run an arbitrary command in a high integrity context, except run as admin leaves it up to you what that command is. So you have the option, upload an artifact to disk, say an executable, and run it, or do something else to weaken the target, or perform a single action you need to perform from that elevated context and operate where you're at otherwise. So with PowerShell, you do have the power to avoid it. All right, operating stageless. What is a stager? I know I kind of covered that earlier, but a tiny program that downloads a payload, passes execution to it. And Cobalt Strike uses stagers everywhere because they're tiny and they work in contexts where a larger payload just won't fit. All right, great. Why are stagers bad? Why do we care? Well, a couple reasons. First, don't ignore this, by the way. A stager is a program. It is a program used for offense purposes. It has its own tells and indicators. And so now you're challenged when you're using stagers of not just getting the stager past whatever defenses are in play, okay? You have to get that past whatever defenses are in play and your payload. So it's another place where your offensive chain can fail. That's bad. If you get rid of stagers, then you have less to worry about. That's the magic of this. But beyond that, ignoring that kind of observation, stagers have some problems. First, they're less secure. Cobalt Strike's beacon payload has security features built in for confidentiality. It has features built in to ensure the integrity of what's going back and forth. And it also, the beacon payload takes steps to authenticate its controller to make it so only the beacon team server that generated it can control it. Stagers don't have these features. Stagers download something, they accept it, they run it. So they are less secure, and that's a trade-off that just comes with their size. They are also, because they're tiny programs written in hand-optimized assembly, they're brittle. They don't cater well to failures or retrying. Some of Cobalt Strike stagers do try a couple things in some cases, but for the most part, they are fragile. They're a very fragile part of your attack chain. And as I mentioned before, because they are the things seen by default, and they are there and present with most offensive actions that their tool sets are associated with, and they're the first thing to be seen, they're more understood. They're easier to detect, and they do have their own indicators. So stagers, while they do bring some benefits in some cases, they are a huge boat anchor of liability in other cases, right? So what do you do to operate stageless? What's Cobalt Strike's model for this? Well, it is possible to get back an artifact, a file, that runs the beacon payload without a stager. You go to Attacks, Packages, Windows Executable S. You can choose which listener to generate a stageless artifact for. You can actually configure the proxy, a hard-coded proxy configuration as well, which is kind of cool. And the output, you can create an executable, a service executable, a 32-bit DLL, a 64-bit DLL, a big PowerShell script, or the most important one is the raw option. And the raw option is a binary blob that works where you would use shellcode. It is a position-independent blob that, when run from wherever, will bootstrap the beacon payload and run it. Okay, so it is a self-bootstrapping reflective DLL. So that's what you get when you select the raw option here. Now, where do we care about operating stageless? We care about operating stageless in any actions we might take that yield a new session, right? So really, the kind of main places you care as an offensive operator are access, getting on your target, session passing, spawning a new session, lateral movement, and privilege escalation. These are kind of the main places where you're spawning a new payload. So for access, a couple of examples. Aggressor script is your best friend here. Aggressor script is the scripting engine baked into Cobalt Strike that lets you automate the tool and extend it and do all kinds of cool things. And if you want automation for generating and setting up attacks that use stageless payloads, right now the answer is build them in Aggressor script. I have a scripted web delivery written in that uses Python, available as a GitHub gist. I have the same thing for PowerShell too. So those are both examples you can work from. Another one that's really cool, feedback often here is that it's well signatured, so it might not be the best thing in operations, but it is a great example. And that's Cactus Torch from Vincent Yu when he was over at MDSec. Cactus Torch happens to use JScript to .NET to run a payload, whether it's a stageless one or a stager. And Vincent did a really nice job writing a aggressor script that gives you a dialogue to set up this attack and change its different options. So it's a great example of what's possible. But really, if you've got a third-party thing that can accept shellcode or a really big blob of shellcode, feed it that raw output from the previous dialogue. That works fine too, no problem. So that's access. What about session passing? Spawning another session. I do that all the time in Cobalt Strike. The answer here, go to the attacks, packages, Windows Executable S dialog, select raw for your output, and now you have a binary file for whatever architecture you chose. To spawn that, doing the same thing as right-click spawn in Cobalt Strike, just use the shspawn command. It really means shellcode. So shspawn will let you select the architecture, because Cobalt Strike won't know from that binary file alone. So shspawn will let you specify the architecture and the local file. And what it will do, spawn a temporary process. All the session prepping that you did benefits from this, and it will inject that raw blob into it. That's it. If you want to inject into a specific process, use shinject, and same thing. So that's how you do session passing. And you can obviously take a blob from another team server and shspawn or shinject it, no problem. When I want to actually session pass but deliver the name pipe beacon from another team server, this is how I do it. What about lateral movement? The psexec, PowerShell, WMIC, WMI, and WinRM commands and beacon, the automation do not have stageless options. Again, I am a huge, huge fan of doing lateral movement by exporting a stageless artifact, copying it over to the target, and running it using any of the many, many different ways to do lateral movement. That is how I do it. That is how I've always done it. Again, 2014's Tradecraft course even really emphasized this. Beacon, before it had these built-in automation things, this is how you did lateral movement with Beacon. Export the stageless artifact, choose the right output type, copy it to the target, use @shtask, WMIC, or SC, or even take advantage of DLL hijacking in some way to get something running on your remote target. Fun aside, Cobalt Strike has had the name pipe beacon since, I want to say late 2013. Hard to believe that feature is going to be 5 years old soon. And fun thing is I very quickly added stageless payloads so you could do lateral movement with the name pipe beacon because that was the goal. So this workflow, this set of ideas, has been with the tool set for a very long time. I definitely recommend you consider taking advantage of this in your own operations. It's a good way to go. What about privilege escalation? This is, of course, another place where you spawn sessions. Hi. I am the first to admit that in all these other places, I keep saying, hey, look, I've exposed the raw primitive to do whatever you want when stagers and PowerShell one-liners don't make sense, right? Well, obviously, privilege escalation and the built-in exploits, that's not the case, right? But there are some options. So if you want to do privilege escalation in a stageless way, of course, export the right artifact, the right stageless one, upload it to your target. And if you want to bypass UAC, use run as admin to kick off your stageless artifact. If you want to elevate because you happen to have known alternate creds, use run as. Both of these are things that come up a lot in exercises and are certainly go-tos. So you do have these options here at the very least. All right, moving along. This is going with a good clip, don't you think? I think we're doing okay. All right, in-memory detections. How do I define in-memory detections? I define it as the use of process, memory, and thread indicators to detect memory-injected DLLs. And Beacon is a memory-injected DLL. It just is. One way to deal with this particular problem is don't be a memory-injected DLL. Use a payload written in, say, Go or .NET. That's not a memory-injected DLL by default. It's just an artifact. But anything you do, honestly, is going to have its own tells, and it's going to have its drawbacks and advantages. But here, memory-injected DLLs do have tells, okay? And in situations where those tells are a liability because they're being used against you, you need to know your options and how to work within that constraint. And that's what we're going to talk about here. So here's 3 sets of tells that I focus on in these lectures and I think about when I'm working with the tool set and developing it. The first has to deal with the start address associated with each thread in a process, okay? And let me give you just some quick background. When you run a program, the program runs, what Windows is going to do is take the executable on disk and it is going to map that executable into the memory of the new process space, okay? So there's going to be a set of pages that are one for one what's in that executable. And Windows is going to know that that region of memory happens to be a memory mapped file, okay? And if Windows knows, that means an analyst can know, an automated security solution can know as well. And when that program loads libraries, DLLs, for its use, same thing. Those are going to be brought into memory as memory mapped files. So there's going to be pages of memory associated with those DLLs. And when those pages of memory are loaded, right? So your code, the things the program's doing, are very likely living in those pages, one of those pages, either in the pages associated with the executable or the pages associated with one of its libraries, right? So when you see code that's running that is not associated with one of those regions of memory, that's weird, okay? So one of the heuristics that's used, Jared Atkinson's get injected thread, which was used against me. I did not learn about this from a presentation. I learned about get injected thread when it was used to smack me in the face. In a good way for blue, not a good way for red, and part of the point of exercise is figuring out what does and doesn't work and getting feedback. So it's a good thing. But what get injected thread does, Jared Atkinson's script, is it walks through all the threads and all the processes that it can see And it looks at the start address because the start address is something you can easily get. And it just checks, is that start address in a region of memory that is associated with a memory map file or a module loaded into the current process. I have to be careful here because you can memory map a file without it being a module, but you're getting me so far. Not being something that is your executable or a loaded DLL is bad. And so it looks for basically thread start addresses that are not backed by a module on disk. And it reports those as requiring analyst attention. And for tool sets and operators that aren't careful, this is a very damning tell. So it's great. It's a really good hunt technique. And if you're not using this, if you're on the blue side and you're watching this presentation, please check it out. Get injected thread's awesome. But that's a tell. That's a heuristic. Memory permissions. Many offensive tool sets will allocate memory and give it very, very, very liberal permissions. Okay, so that's a read, write, execute. Hey, let me do everything. And you might be saying, okay, they do that because offensive tools have to do it, right? Like offensive tools have to say, I'm offensive and I'm flagging an evil bit, right? No. In some cases, offensive tools allocate RWX permissions because it's a lazy and easy default. In other cases, it is done out of necessity. For example, a payload stager expects to receive a encoded payload stage. And an encoded payload stage needs RWX memory because it's going to decode itself in place and execute in place. So that's why you happen to see RWX in some places. When speaking of memory permissions, which I'm doing here, I'm speaking of, you notice I'm kind of got a comma separating them. Really, two things are visible when looking at memory permissions. Windows gives up what the initial permissions are of a block of memory and what the current permissions are. The in-between state's not available unless you're watching for and recording that, but the initial and current state is. So RWX might come up in normal use occasionally, especially for things like interpreters. But be aware of that initial permissions because they might not be RWX. And that's why I say the allocation and current protection pairs are dangerous indicators that you need to be aware of. On top of the permissions problem, there's also the memory content. Looking like a DLL in memory, like just being a DLL that's floating around in memory, not associated with a memory map file, is weird. Okay, so your content can get you. The other thing with the content too is you might have strings that are known by your defenders and used to target the tool set. All right, when talking about memory indicators, this little chart shows the artifacts in Cobalt Strike and which indicators they have that are bad, which ones they have that are good. And so this gives you an idea of what you might consider safe or not safe to use. Okay, so that's why this is here. All right, beyond the artifact, which does have a lot of influence on which of those indicators you might trigger or those heuristics you might run afoul against. Let's talk about the payload itself. Cobalt Strike's beacon happens to have a technology called malleable PE. And I introduced this in Cobalt Strike 3.7. I think that was March 2017. Malleable PE is a pretty simple idea. Here it is. I've got a DLL, that's beacon. Really, it's never going to be used as a DLL. Never, ever, ever. There's only one loader that's going to load it. And that's the reflective loader that ships with it, okay? So I control the DLL, I control the loader. What can I do with those two things, still having a DLL, to buy some evasion benefit against certain kinds of heuristics that target content, permissions, what have you. And malleable P is an exploration of that. So there's a lot of modifications you can make. We'll talk about some of these in a moment. But let me show you what malleable P looks like. It happens to be a block within a malleable C2 profile, and that's the stage block. And it lets you apply these transforms to the 32-bit beacon and to the 64-bit beacon, and it happens to let you set several options as well. And this is what a malleable PE block looks like. So this is the thing that will let you control the beacon payload and some of its indicators, even though you don't have the source code to the beacon payload. All right, let's go through those heuristics and talk about what your options are. For the thread start address, the executables and DLLs from Cobalt Strike, particularly stageless ones, are fine. I've scrubbed those for the things that those artifacts can control. For the post-exploitation jobs, the ones that spawn a temporary process, because that's come up a lot, right? Those post-exploitation jobs don't usually do remote process injection in a way that's dangerous here. What they try to do is spawn a process, spawn it suspended, take the main thread of that process and hijack it. That's what Beacon does for its post-exploitation jobs. In that case, the start address for that temporary process is just going to be the entry point of the process. So that's going to look fine against this heuristic. Word of warning though, you really only get that benefit when you're using a 64-bit beacon on a 64-bit target and a 32-bit beacon on a 32-bit target. If you're in a 32-bit beacon on a 64-bit target and you need to spawn a 64-bit post-exploitation job, then Cobalt Strike's going to have to fall back to the create remote thread method of remote process injection, and that will look like garbage to this heuristic. That will get picked up. So for dealing with the thread start address in your operations, certainly use a beacon that is the same architecture as the target you're operating from, and avoid injecting into an existing remote process. Temporary processes are okay. What about memory permissions? What do you do about that? Well, avoid artifacts that use RWX permissions. The chart I gave you a few slides ago highlights what some of those are. Avoid stagers. The stagers in Cobalt Strike always allocate memory with RWX permissions. They do that because, again, we're expecting to get a encoded payload with the that decodes itself in place. So avoid stagers, and if you want to avoid RWX permissions when the beacon payload is setting itself up, set the use RWX option in your malleable P stage block to false. And when beacon's loader allocates memory for beacon, it will take care to avoid the use of RWX permissions and use what's correct for each section of the payload. Another cool thing, this is a really neat feature brought into Cobalt Strike 3.11, is module stomping. And it takes some care to use this feature correctly. You need to really select a DLL that makes sense. But module stomping, what it does is it has beacon take a DLL that you specify, and it calls load library. So that DLL is now loaded into the process space, all legitimate. And what beacon does is it then finds where that DLL lives in memory. And quick word of warning, it's going to find the middle of that DLL, not the beginning. And instead of allocating new memory, beacon instead overwrites that DLL and copies your initialized beacon there. So that's pretty cool. That is a great way to have memory permissions that make sense. It is a great way to fly under the radar of solutions and analytical tools that are scrutinizing executable pages, regions of memory that have executable code that are not backed by a module on disk. Because you can make yourself backed by a module on disk. That's what you're doing there. And you do that with the module x86 option and the module x64 option. Again, that feature, when I first introduced it, I said it's a bit of a foot gun. There's a lot of opportunity to get it wrong, and if you do, you will crash your payload. But when you get it right, it can be a really, really great, a great option for challenging some of these detections. What about memory content? All right, there's some really cool play here. This is one of the things I think is both simple and neat at the same time. First, you can prepend junk information to your beacon payload. And you may be asking, why would I want to do that? Under what circumstances will that help me? Well, if you're dealing with point-in-time analysis, oftentimes if a script, a hunt tool finds something suspicious, it might report back the first 100 bytes or so to an analyst. So here, you can control what those 100 bytes are and make it into something that might cause an analyst to skip you and go looking at something else. So prepend is a tool to help there. Another thing, some hunt tools will not do a linear scan byte by byte of memory looking for signs of a DLL. Instead, what they might end up doing is going page by page and looking at the beginning of the page to see if they find signs of a memory-injected DLL, and if they don't, they stop their search. So prepend is a way to kind of break the expectation that your memory-injected DLL is at the beginning of a page and defeat those kinds of solutions. So that's pretty neat. What about those known strings? I mentioned they can be a bit of a pickle. If you have known strings that are in the beacon payload and you have a great relationship with your blue team, because the goal is to challenge them, right? Like you don't want them getting bored. You can use the string replace primitive, strrep, to get rid of those, change them to something else. You might degrade some of the payload's functionality in some cases, but it's there. It is an option when that's a problem. So you can use string replace to get rid of like reflective loader. Like that's one in general. If you're going to do a scan of memory looking for strings, that's a great one to go looking for. So that'll pick up things like Empire in some cases. It'll pick up Beacon by default. It'll pick up Meterpreter. And probably even other things that didn't change the name of that exported function. So string replace is a way to get rid of that. The memory injected DLL does have a lot of strings. It has a lot of tells. And using string replace to get rid of things like this program cannot be run in DOS mode or the rich header. That's a lot of work. I get it. This is why Beacon has an obfuscate option. Obfuscate does a couple things. So for the self-bootstrapping reflective DLL package, which is something separate, obfuscate goes through the DLL header and just destroys everything except the MZ header, the PE header, and the ELFA new value. Everything else is just destroyed. It goes through the rest of the DLL and it masks the import table. So the strings associated with functions and modules you import are not in the clear anymore. And it masks other strings associated with the DLL. So with obfuscate on, a lot of strings are taken off the table. The other thing obfuscate does when it's set to on is when your beacon package, that self-bootstrapping reflective DLL, initializes your DLL in new space. When obfuscate's on, it will actually initialize the beacon DLL in new space without the PE header. It just brings it over without it. Just doesn't need it. Okay? And that's great. When you combine this with use RWX, when you combine this with module stomping, you've got the ability to make the final beacon DLL look pretty good in memory. That's a really neat set of primitives, I think, for memory-injected DLL. But there is a problem, and that is the self-bootstrapping package that runs your beacon DLL, that initializes it. That is still there in some memory wherever your artifact put it. Most likely, your artifact called virtual alloc, and most likely that self-bootstrapping package is in memory, not backed by a module on disk. And that self-bootstrapping package does have the MZ, the PE, and the ELFA new values. They are a liability. What do you do about these? Well, that's the cleanup option. Set cleanup to true, and once beacon is initialized into its new home with all these things you've turned on, it will call virtual free to get rid of the package that put it there. So if you're dealing with point-in-time analysis in the future, the package that loaded you is no longer present to give you away. So these are some things you can use to deal with memory content problems as well. All right, wow, lots on memory evasion. Let's talk about process injection. We're getting near the end here. That's great. So process injection, please. This is the theme of the entire presentation. Process injection was an evasion. Hacking tools don't do process injection because they're trying to look like hacking tools. Hacking tools use process injection because at one time it was a way to do things in a very stealthy way. And it should be no surprise that defenses are evolving to detect it because it's a great evasion when there's nothing that detects it. It's awesome. So again, theme of this presentation, there are times process injection into a remote process is a liability. Okay, I get it. What do you do? Well, let's say you need to run something that targets a remote process, targets a specific remote process. You can inject into yourself. That might work. And what do I mean by that? Well, like the screenshot command. Lets you specify a process and an architecture. Inject it into your current beacon process. Cobalt Strike will treat that situation differently from others. It will allocate memory in the current process, copy the payload there. It won't use write process memory. It's just copying from one part of memory to another. It can do that. And it creates a thread to kick off the capability. So that's an option. You're not doing remote process injection. Another thing, if you need to move between desktop sessions, you can do it without process injection. An example I used earlier is you laterally move onto a box. You're in desktop session 0, and the good stuff's happening in desktop session 1 where a user's working, and you want to be there. Normally, the way we do it is we inject, right? Like that's how we get there. Well, you can move between desktop sessions without process injection. Use the run u command to run some program under the context of a program in that other desktop session. That will work. So that's a way to get a session over there. And of course, you can self-inject to start gathering screenshots and keystrokes from that context. And you may be saying, that's cool. That's nice, Raph, thanks. But I wish that were automated. And I know, I get it. The use of process injection is what the tool set has you do. That's the default. That's all the workflows. I get it. But remember the theme of this presentation, the title, Fighting the Toolset. This entire presentation is about doing these offensive actions without the workflows, by going around them, doing things that are counterintuitive to them. That's fighting the toolset. So yeah, this is a way to move between desktop sessions without remote process injection, and a way to start gathering information using the injecting into yourself. Is it work? Is it cumbersome? Is it not convenient? Sure. But I got to tell you, I think that the fact it's possible is really cool. That's something I'm very proud of. Another thing, too, is be aware that there really are two kinds of remote process injection. There is process injection where you're just creating a brand new thread in a process, and process injection where you're taking over a thread in a process. And in some cases, one is okay, and in some cases, neither is okay. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you've got a solution, a security solution that is looking at all new threads, hooking that inline, and they're looking for those memory indicators we talked about a moment ago. They're looking at the memory associated with the new thread that's about to start and looking to see if it's backed by a module on disk. They're looking to see if it's backed by a module on disk. They're looking at its permissions. They're looking at its content and trying to decide whether or not to allow that thread to run. And that will happen in the case of remote process injection too. Okay, yeah, that's bad. And that's not in our favor. But let's say that same solution is in play, but we're doing process injection where we hijack an existing thread, like what Cobalt Strike does for temporary processes. Well, there, I'm not calling create remote thread. There, I'm taking an existing thread that's already got its properties, and I'm just updating it. So when it's resumed, it happens just kick off executing from where I want it to. And so with some tools, that might actually escape scrutiny. Cool story, right? But it's only going to apply in situations where Beacon, for its temporary jobs, is hijacking an existing thread. And remember, if you're in a 32-bit Beacon on a 64-bit system, that's not always going to happen. So make sure, if you are on a 64-bit system, if you care about this topic, that you are in a 64-bit Beacon. That should be like part of your checklist, part of your tradecraft. So that's what I've got to say about remote process injection. Where you might use it, there's sometimes alternatives to working without it. And sometimes some forms of remote process injection are okay and others are not. And that's the point here. All right. I've taken you through a lot of material here. We talked about fighting the toolset, workflows, design decisions in Cobalt Strike that are there for the benefit of offensive operations. But those same things that are a benefit are also the subject of commercial and academic and industry research, trying to find ways to take those benefits and turn them into a disadvantage. Okay? And fighting the toolset is being aware of when those things are a disadvantage and exploring and using alternatives. We talked about how to cope with the temporary processes for post-exploitation jobs with session prepping. We talked about how to work without PowerShell, how to work without stagers. We talked about how to survive and thrive as a memory-injected DLL. And we talked about remote process injection as well. Now, just to kind of close this up, I owe you a few resources and we're done. All right. A lot of the material in this presentation comes from a blog post I put out last year called Modern Defenses and You. What was really cool about the post is it says the same things I say here. It gives the same tips. It's more concise. What it lacks is the why, the in-depth explanation of each of these topics and why you should care, why you should follow my suggestions. And I really feel that each section of this blog post could easily be a series of blog posts or a collection of lectures on that topic, because there's a lot of material there in a very short amount of space. And I think it's very important stuff to put out. Another blog post, if you like this material and you like awareness of what your tools are doing, is OPSEC considerations for Beacon commands. This blog post goes through the things Beacon does, its various commands, and talks about how they're implemented. Some commands use an API and don't launch a new process. You'd be surprised how many people have asked me if the ls command in Beacon launches dir underneath the hood and parses the output. And it's like, no, I use Windows APIs. And if you've got questions about that, this blog post puts them to rest. It tells you what does what, and it gives you advice on what you should consider avoiding and in what situations. So if you like this material and this lecture, this is a great blog post. Here's another one. I mentioned before that Rundle 32 is a default that is used throughout the Cobalt Strike toolset. is used anytime Cobalt Strike wants to migrate to a process or spawn a new process. But it's just that. It's a default. And I mentioned that it is my job to make you aware that it's a default and make you aware that you have the ability to change that default. And this blog post from July 2016 is where I did that. So if you're curious about Rundle 32 and how to scrub it from the tool set, go here. This is the place to go. Another one is the payload staging, right? I mentioned that staging has disadvantages. In the blog post, Talk to Your Children About Payload Staging, I go through those disadvantages and I highlight the fact that payload staging really only matters when you need to create a new payload, like spawn a new access, right? And I talk about the workflows, the workflow adjustments to operate with Cobalt Strike, but without using stagers. So very similar to the few slides we went through here. So if you're curious about operating stageless, this is the go-to blog post. Finally, again, in Modern Defenses in You, I stated that any one of the things in that post could easily become a series of lectures or a series of blog posts, right? And I made good on that in one spot, and that's with in-memory evasion. Last year, I wrote like 2 paragraphs and gave a bulleted list of 5 tips. I'm like, do X, Y, and Z. And I said, just trust me. And I understand that might not convince you. So for those who really want to know why, I put together a 4 and now actually 5-part course on in-memory evasion. The 5th part is an addendum that came out with Cobalt Strike 3.11. This series of lectures goes through in-memory detections and why they work. It goes through Cobalt Strike's attack chain and why it has those tells and what part is responsible for it. And it tells you what you have control over and how to take advantage of it. So this is a really cool set of material. And if you enjoyed the in-memory stuff, I really recommend you go here as your next step. Finally, the last resource. The big focus in Cobalt Strike is flexibility. I don't really care that something is easy. I care that it's possible. And as I continue to expand the tool set and develop it, I keep trying to find ways to give you control over its indicators and give you control over the attack chain that this tool represents. And in kits, profiles, and scripts, oh my, I walk you through all the different options you have to kind of customize different parts of Cobalt Strike and what they look like, and point you to the resources to learn more about each. I'm under the impression that very few of the customers in the Cobalt Strike user base really appreciate and fully understand all the material in this particular blog post. And I think that's on me to keep putting out material to help you take advantage of it. That's part of the reason you get lectures like this one. But if you get a chance and you want to really know how you can take further ownership of this tool set and really mold it to be a combination of what I give you and your secret sauce in a forward compatible way, go to this blog post. This is the starter reference for that topic. All right, my God, I know, a lot of material, right? I hope you enjoyed this lecture. We talked about fighting the tool set and working around the defaults in Cobalt Strike and where those behaviors and design decisions go from being an advantage to a liability and how to cope with that. I hope you've enjoyed this material. Good luck and happy hacking.